All right, guys, we have made it to the end of the line. This is the last day of notes for World History 1 for the school year. It's also going to be our last day of notes for the East Asia unit. We just finished up the Mongols last class. We're going to cover Japan, and before we get into the notes, go ahead and take a look at this painting, and using the comment section on the right, go ahead and list some of the natural features that you see in this painting. Take about 30 seconds to do that now. So some of the things that you might have noticed in the background, we have got this mountain. It's actually a volcano. It's Mount Fuji. In front of the mountain, we've got some land, and that land, if you notice, is actually brown. So that might tell you a little bit about how fertile their land is. And then at the front, we've got this tidal wave. So in Japan, there's going to be a big emphasis on nature as we go through this PowerPoint. So before we get started talking about the people of Japan, let's talk about the geography. Japan is a mountainous archipelago made up of 4 main islands and many more smaller islands surrounding it. Archipelago is a vocabulary term you're going to need to remember. An archipelago is a chain of islands. The one we're probably most familiar with are the Hawaiian Islands, but another one that you might have heard of are the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Japan is located in close proximity east of China and Korea, and there is a sea that separates Japan from the rest of the Asian mainland. The Japanese would call it the Sea of Japan, whereas if you live on continental Asia, you would call it the East Sea. The sea would protect and isolate Japan. And as we know, natural barriers like this sea can cause a lack of cultural diffusion. 85% of Japan is mountainous, which means we don't have much fertile land. It's going to be difficult to grow our crops, and Japan lacks natural resources. And that's going to be very similar to another civilization we talked about earlier this year. And hopefully you're thinking of the Greeks. And of course, the Greeks had to turn to sailing in order to get the resources they needed. Japan has been hit by many natural disasters over its history. Volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, which are tidal waves, and typhoons, which are hurricanes in the Pacific Ocean, are all common in Japan. So the Japanese have a strong respect for nature. So looking at the map of Japan, you can see that Japan is broken up into 4 main islands with many, many more islands surrounding it. This sea would be called the East Sea if you live in China, but to Japan, it is the Sea of Japan. Japan is located on the edges of a tectonic plate. We can see it over here. And we call the boundary of this plate the Ring of Fire, as we have so many volcanoes, we have so much seismic activity going on in this area that it can lead to disaster. In the background of this picture, we have the volcano, Mount Fuji. To the right is a Japanese pagoda, which is made out of wood. A pagoda is a temple. And then at the bottom of this picture, we have cherry blossoms. And you guys are probably familiar with cherry blossoms in DC. In March, they have the Cherry Blossom Festival, and those cherry blossoms were actually a gift from Japan to the United States in the early 1900s. So in early Japan, these islands have been divided up into hundreds of clans, and each clan controlled their own territory. But by 400 CE, the Yamato clan was the leading clan, and the Yamato claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. This meant that in effect their leader was a god. And the Yamato chiefs would call themselves emperors of Japan, but they didn't actually control much territory. Rival clans fought for power, and the winner ruled in the emperor's name. So they would make laws for the emperor, they would go to war for the emperor, whether the emperor really liked it or not. So the Yamato emperors lacked any real power. They were more or less figureheads. Think about like the Franks when we had a king, but it was really the mayor of the palace who held the power. And it's at this time that the rising sun would become the symbol for Japan, and we see it on their flag today. On the left, we have a drawing of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and on the right, we have the flag of Japan during World War II, and in the center, you have the sun with its rays coming forth. The ethnic religion of Japan was called Shinto, and it was unique to the Japanese. Shintoism placed an importance on natural features, forces of nature, and ancestor worship, much like what we saw in China. They believed in kami, and kami were divine spirits that dwelled in nature. You could find kami in beautiful trees, unusual rocks, waterfalls, or mountains. All of these could be considered a home for a kami. Followers of Shintoism would worship at torii gates. These are Shinto shrines, and we'll look at some examples. And Shinto would become the state religion of Japan. It was intertwined with the government. And the followers of Shintoism would worship the emperor as a living god. And they would do that all the way up until the end of World War II, when the United States occupied Japan. The emperor had to come out and tell everybody that he was not a god. This is an example of a torii gate. It's a Shinto shrine that's found on a lake, and they would say that a kami or spirit inhabited the lake. We're going to see some more examples, but you might want to jot this down on your notes. The torii gates all look very similar. You've got two of these columns or posts, and then at the top, you've got two beams going across. This unusual rock formation could have been home to a kami, which is why they built the torii gate on top of it. And you might even find a torii gate in someone's backyard as it leads to the Shinto shrine. Once again, our torii gate is made up of two posts, and then at the top you have two beams going across. And of course, I'm a big fan of the fox statue back here towards the temple. So we said earlier there was a sea that separated Japan from China, and that made cultural interaction difficult. But by the 600s CE, the Japanese began to send missions to China to learn what was going on in China. And one of the things that was brought back was the system of Chinese writing. The Japanese would take these Chinese characters and adapt them to their own language. They also took on the Chinese artistic style as well. The Chinese built their structures out of wood. We would see the Japanese do the same. And religion was also spread. Buddhism, which had come all the way from India, had traveled to China and Korea, was brought to Japan by Chinese and Korean missionaries. Missionaries are people who spread religion. Buddhism was accepted by the Japanese court, and Buddhism would coexist with Shinto. And Buddhist rituals became Shinto rituals. These two religions became intertwined and worked together in Japan. This is a piece of Japanese artwork called Landscape of the Four Seasons, and of course it features nature prominently. It was created using ink, and they would use water to dilute the ink to give different shades of gray. But if you look at this, you can see that there are no humans, no animals. It's based on nature. In 794 CE, the imperial court was moved to Heian. Heian is today Kyoto. And the nobles moved to the city and became part of the imperial court. They would act as advisors to the emperor. And during this time, elaborate rituals and ceremonies would take place within the court. Nobles pursued the arts. Proper etiquette was very important. And we have literature, which was actually written by women, something that we didn't see in our earlier civilizations. The world's first novel, The Tale of Genji was written during this time period by Lady Murasaki, and it was about the life of a prince living in the imperial court. And of course, we also have sumo wrestling. It was very important for nobles to show up to court wearing the latest fashions. They didn't want to fall behind. It would make them look bad. During the Heian period, you could watch sumo wrestling as a form of entertainment. And even today, if you're watching ESPN2 in the late hours, sometimes they'll have sumo on as they're trying to fill out all their time slots. The goal of sumo wrestling is for you to throw your opponent to his back or knock him out of the ring. And before the match would take place, there were elaborate rituals that would go on, such as throwing salt around the ring in order to purify the ground which you would fight on. And there are weight classes when it comes to sumo wrestling, but just like in boxing, everyone wants to see the heavyweights go at it to see who is really the baddest. The Fujiwara clan held most of the power during the Heian period. But over time, their power began to fade. And what happened was large landowners would establish their own private armies because the countryside had become lawless and dangerous. It was a lot like what happened after the fall of Rome, when there was no longer a strong central power to protect all the people. People looked to lords to protect them. So Japan ends up with feudalism as their government style. And farmers would trade parts of their land to warlords who were called daimyo for protection. And with more land, the daimyo, or lord, could gain more power and establish their own local government, or feudal government, and they would do this all across Japan. And each daimyo would then surround himself with bodyguards called samurai, which sounds a lot like a lord who would surround himself with knights. So we're going to see many similarities between the samurai of Japan and the knights of Europe. Samurai means one who serves, and they serve the daimyo in exchange for land. They followed a code of conduct called Bushido, which means the way of the warrior. And in Bushido, a samurai must show reckless courage when he goes into battle. He must show respect for his lord and gods, and fairness and generosity to the weak. And of course, this sounds a lot like the code that the knights followed, which was called chivalry. They trained in swordsmanship, archery, and jujitsu. If you guys are lucky, I'll also post a video of a certain history teacher at Woodson who does jujitsu. The samurai followed the religion of Zen Buddhism, and in Zen Buddhism, they would practice meditation and promise to devote themselves to their duty, following their lord's commands. A samurai did not fear death. In fact, their greatest joy was going in the battle and dying on behalf of their lord. If a samurai broke the code of Bushido, he might even commit seppuku, which was ritual suicide. So if he lost a battle and survived or dishonored his lord, he would kill himself. On the right, we can see a samurai donning their armor, and this armor would have been made up of mostly boiled leather with some iron scales as well. And then on the left, we see samurai out in the countryside who are protecting a farm. In the top left corner, you can see people practicing jujitsu. Jujitsu is a form of unarmed combat, and samurai would learn this in case they were knocked off their horse or disarmed. The goal is to throw your opponent to the ground and then disable them either by choking them and cutting off the oxygen supply to their brain, or put them in a joint lock like an arm bar and pretty much making their arm go the direction it's not supposed to bend. If you've ever watched UFC before, they're using a combination of wrestling and jiu-jitsu when both fighters are on the ground fighting it out. On the right, we have our samurai with all of his armor on. Just like the knights, they wore armor, but the armor was quite a bit different. And the Japanese would use a sword called a katana. The samurai would also ride on horseback in the battle and were also well versed in the bow and arrow. The helmets that they wore quite elaborate, and they would also use them not just for personal protection, but to intimidate their enemy. And of course, anyone who has a mustache on their face mask That's going to be intimidating when they're chasing you down and trying to hit you with their sword. Here we have a depiction of seppuku. So if a samurai had dishonored his daimyo, he would kill himself, but there was a ritual involved. You would take your sword and you would stab yourself in the left side of your stomach, and you would go across the right side and then go up so that all of your guts would spill out. And this was a long process. Now, luckily for you, you would have your best friend standing behind you. And if you looked like you were going to scream out in pain, which was a big no-no, he was there to cut your head off. And that's what friends are for. So in this picture, we have a recreation of a samurai who's going to commit seppuku. And I really like these guys' hairstyles. I think that should make a comeback. During the late 1100s, Japan's two most powerful clans fought for power. The Minamoto clan would win out in 1192, and the emperor called the Minamoto leader the shogun. Shogun means supreme general of the emperor's army, and we call this type of government the shogunate. The emperor continued to rule in Kyoto as a puppet, but it was the shogun who held the real power in Japan because the shogun was the one who controlled the army. And this system would last all the way until 1868. This is Yoritomo, the first shogun. His hat kind of looks like his chair, and his beard game is pretty weak though. He's got a lot of gaps to fill in. The social structure of Japan is as follows. At the top of the social hierarchy, you have the shogun and the emperor. The shogun held the real power, while the emperor was more or less just a religious leader. Below them are the daimyo. These are the lords, and each of them would have their own plot of land, which they would control. And the daimyo would employ samurai. Samurai were the warriors, and in return for their loyalty to the daimyo would give the samurai a smaller plot of land. Below the samurai were the peasants. These are your farmers and your commoners. And in the bottom of society were merchants. These were the least respected group in society because the Japanese felt like they didn't really make anything. At least the farmers provided food for all the people to survive. All right, so here we go. This is the last slide of notes for the entire year. And we touched on the Mongol invasion of Japan last class. The Mongols tried to invade Japan twice under the leadership of Kublai Khan, once in 1274 and again in 1281. Both times, Japan was saved by a typhoon. A typhoon is a hurricane in the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese called this typhoon the kamikaze. Kami means divine or spirit, and kaze means wind. So kamikaze, divine wind, or spirit wind. And the kamikaze destroyed up to 75% of the Mongolian army. Most of these soldiers were still on these ships, and those who did make it ashore were killed off by the samurai. Now, you guys have probably heard the term kamikaze in reference to World War II, when we had the Japanese fighter pilots who would dive bomb their planes into American ships. So that's it for notes for the entire year, and keep checking Blackboard, and we'll keep you posted for what's coming next.